Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. Today's topic is Lecture 25, The Coming of the Civil War. Now, before we begin, as always, take a moment, hit pause on your screen, jot down the lecture outline, paying particular attention to those key terms at the top. Make sure you can identify the who, what, where, when, and why, as well as be able to connect them to each other and to their larger historical context. Now, with that, let's begin. Now, we left off with the crisis in 1950 and ultimately the compromise of 1850 that for a time at least would, kick the can down the road in regards to our disagreement over the institution of slavery. And of course, we climaxed in 1854 with the Kansas-Nebraska Act and subsequent Bleeding Kansas. Now, you got to realize by the mid-1850s, we have two very separate regions in our country. We have the North, we have the South. And the thing is, despite both being quote-unquote American, they are very different in how they see themselves and how they see each other. For example, the North sees themselves as a place of bustling commerce. They have small, independent farms, especially in the Midwest. And they believe in a free labor system, wage labor, and of course they want a more active government. They see themselves as being the harbingers of democracy. They have belief in individualism, that everyone can work, they can better themselves and achieve what becomes the American dream. The idea of the free wage labor system, it allows upward mobility. Someone can come, they can work their butt off, they can work hard, they can get ahead, they can become a boss, they can become a business owner. And in order to facilitate all this process, the North did believe that government should take a larger role in society that promotes and protects free labor, that promotes and protects industrial growth, that does offer some immigration. Now, of course, this is a double-edged sword. Who really wants immigration here? Does the average working person? Probably not. But those corporations do, because it enables them to have a cheap labor source and undermines the American worker to depress wages. So again, it's not all about hunky-dory here. And they believe, of course, in foreign trade that's protected by tariffs, along with infrastructure improvements. Again, all those things the old Federalist Party believed in, all those things that the Whigs believed in, the North tends to embrace these ideas. But here's the kicker, is the argument that North made. Again, there's disagreements over immigration. There's going to be disagreements, if you ever take 1302, that talk about how wage laborers were, in fact, suppressed and oppressed. But the common belief that whether you were working class or an owner was that only free men could achieve economic progress. In Northern eyes, therefore, the worst sin of all was the loss of one's freedom. Thus, slavery was the root of all evil. The South was the antithesis of everything that Northerners saw as good. To Northerners, Southerners were backward, unfree, economically stagnant, lawless, immoral, and uneducated in the modern virtues of the modern world. But on the other standpoint, the South, while the South was quite divided in reality, we discussed that already, a large percentage are slaves, you have almost 4 million slaves at this point, only about 25% of Southern whites actually own slaves, but yet despite being very diverse economically and socially and even culturally, all Southern whites generally adhered to the values of the planter class, that 25%. And what they saw as most important was not individual freedom, but rather social values. They saw themselves as courteous, refined, hospitable, chivalrous, whereas the North was full of coarse, ill-mannered, aggressive, materialistic people. In addition, because they lived under constant fear of slave revolts, Southerners had 5 times as many military schools as the North did. The North wasn't worried about war. The South was constantly worried about revolt and rebellion and conspiracy. So you can look at just the idea of education. You can see the microcosm of how the North and South differed. Now remember, this is still pre-public school system here. That will not be developed until the postbellum era. But the Northerners believe in educating the many for economic utility. In other words, educate people so they can become productive economic members of society, i.e., work in a factory. The South, however, believed that you educate the few for character. In other words, you educate a few noble people who will have the charge of ruling over the masses. In other words, this is not really broad-based democracy, but rather a few elites who are well-educated and well-funded are able to control the masses of people. In addition, the comparison draws stark contrast when looking at the role of government. Whereas the North believed in big government, active government, the South wanted to go back to that Jeffersonian past. They do cherish the Union of the United States, but they want that Jeffersonian past wherein states' rights reign, things like doctrine of nullification, those exist. And they believe that the Yankees are too much in a hurry to change those things, to gut their way of life. In short, each side, North and South, viewed each other as threatening each other's freedom and degrading each other's proper economy, proper society. Each saw the other as imposing barriers to their vision of a great American future. The North saw the South as a slave power, determined to end the slave system and impart free labor throughout the land. The South, on the other hand, saw the North as full of quote-unquote black republicanism, determined to destroy their way of life. Now, what held the nation together, however, as we discussed previously, is the two-party system. As long as there existed a number of Southerners who believed in big government, i.e. the Whig Party, and as long as there were a number of Northerners who still believed in the Democratic Party, Party of Jackson, small government, as long as that existed, we were able to make a compromise. But as we saw in the last lecture, thanks to the Kansas-Nebraska Act and Bleeding Kansas, this was no longer possible. On the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Whig Party dies, and Southerners vote as Southerners, Northerners vote as Northerners. The South becomes the Democratic Party, and the North becomes the new Republican Party. As we push into the second half of the decade of the 1850s, this animosity, this conspiratorial theory between the two sides only intensifies. And both sides have good ammunition that support this vision. So again, you see this North versus the South. The South believes very chivalrously, going with the win society, versus the North, who are a chivalrous society. And this first big issue comes in the Dred Scott decision. You see, in 1857, again, this is a couple years after Bleeding Kansas, but in 1857, it only reinforced those arguments who believed in this slave power conspiracy. In other words, the slave power conspiracy said that basically the 1%ers, in this case the 25% of Southern whites who owned slaves, the educating the few, they were seeking to destroy democracy and impart their will over the masses, over democracy. And in other words, a few mastermind individuals, well-funded, are able to control the entire country, disrupting democracy. In this case, spread slavery everywhere. So in 1857, the Supreme Court makes an important ruling in our history. It's the Dred Scott versus Sanford decision. Now, you realize this is not a new case in 1857. This had been at the Supreme Court for 3 years. This was a case that began back in 1846. Now, what happens is, back in 1846, Dred and his wife Harriet Scott, both slaves, They had filed a lawsuit in Missouri to seek their freedom. So here's the issue. A few years prior, their master had taken Dred and Harriet Scott on a trip to the Wisconsin Territory. Now you see on your map there, it does say free state. However, back in the 1840s, it had not become a state yet. It was still a territory. And as the Wisconsin Territory, as it were, they were taken there. And the argument they made was that because their master had taken them into a territory, the Missouri Territory, where the Missouri Compromise had prohibited slavery, remember it's above the 3630 line, and therefore, because their master had taken into a free territory, therefore they should be free. Now, back in the 1840s, of course, this was not the biggest issue on the docket, but by 1855, 1856, 1857, slavery was the hot button issue that was threatening to tear apart our country. And so the court in this decision in 1857, which had a Southern majority of the 9 Supreme Court justices, in a 7-2 decision. On the one hand, they ruled that Dred and Harriet Scott were indeed slaves. Now, that was honestly the minor decision here, because in addition to the decision that they were still slaves, the Supreme Court went further and outlined 3 very important decisions. And these 3 very important decisions would have large ramifications on our country. So in this 7-2 decision, which again, that's monumental in itself, you should know most decisions are always 5-4, it seems. This was a pretty wide, easy, open and shut case for the Supreme Court. But they made these 3 very important key rulings. Number 1, so because blacks were an inferior order who had no rights which white men ought to respect. Let me repeat that one more time. Because they argued that blacks were an inferior order, an inferior species, they have no rights which whites ought to respect. And therefore, Dred Scott was not a citizen and had no right to sue in court. Think about that. This Dred Scott decision rules that African Americans have no right as citizens, and thus they have no power to even go to court. Number 1 decision. Number 2 decision. The Missouri Compromise, they ruled, in this Dred Scott decision, was unconstitutional because they argued Congress does not have the power to ban slavery in territories. Now, this goes back to the old argument over these new states would be inherently less free if Congress decides the issue of slavery for them, rather than the people who live there themselves. But they invalidated this Missouri Compromise, a compromise that has held the country together for 37 years by this point. They ruled it unconstitutional. Now, those 2 were big enough. But those 2 weren't the kicker. Number 3 is the real kicker here. So number 3, a slave being taken in and out of free states or territories does not affect Dred Scott's status. Now, obviously, this was directed at Dred Scott, but think about the larger implication here. A Southern slave owner can theoretically take their slave from Alabama, take a trip up to Michigan, Ohio, New York, and settle down on a farm there with their slaves in a free state. But the slave is still not free. This decision went far beyond just Dred Scott. Yes, the arguments about black citizenship infuriated Northerners, because many were saying, well, if they don't have the right to sue in court, what right do they have at all, even in the North? But more troubling, if a Southerner could take their slaves to a free state and keep them as slaves, not affecting their status, then where does the boundary of slavery end? And of course, the answer is nowhere. The Dred Scott decision theoretically opens up the door to slavery everywhere in the United States. Free or slave didn't matter as far as statehood goes. What mattered was the status of the slave from which they came. Of the black person from which they came. Again, this seemed to justify that idea that there's a Southern slave conspiracy, that these 1%ers, these 25% of Southern whites who actually own a slave, they are controlling and dominating not only their way of life economically speaking, socially speaking, morally speaking, but now they're controlling the federal government and the Supreme Court. This is a threat to democracy because blacks have absolutely no rights under this decision. And every free state of the North is now under attack that their constitution can be invalidated when they ban slavery. This is by far the North's worst nightmare and a crisis of democracy. But not to be outdone, the South would have their day in the rain where they believed the North was out to get them. And it largely came as a result of this man. Remember him, John Brown, the one who led the raid on Pottawatomie Creek, and along with his sons, hacked 5 men to death with broadswords, right, during Bleeding Kansas. Well, Southerners are applauding the Dred Scott decision. They soon began to fear the extent to which Northerners would go to overthrow the institution of slavery. John Brown, and yes, there is a video link that you can watch to learn more about John Brown. It's a fascinating look at his life because he's a fascinating individual. Now, on the left of your screen, you see the picture from circa early 1850s. The picture on the right, though, is from 1857, 1858, and 1859. You see, he's got a little more biblical looking, right? Remember, this is the guy who believes he's doing God's will, hacking men with broadswords, going medieval on them. Again, this is a man who believes he's doing God's will. Well, in 1859, he has a new plan, looking very Moses-like there, wants to free the slaves. And he organizes a raid on Harper's Ferry in Western Virginia. Now, it's Virginia back then. It's now in West Virginia if you go visit it. So his plan is on October 16, 1859, to lead a raid of 22 white and African-American men to attack the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Very simple plan. Lead 22 men into the federal arsenal, get weapons, hope to provoke a mass uprising of slaves in Virginia, and more broadly the Upper South. As they give guns to the African-American slaves, they can fight their way to freedom. Again, very simple plan, very similar to the plans we saw during the attacks on slavery lecture. The interesting part here is not everyone was on board with this plan. Because quite honestly, it sounds a little crazy. If you think so, it is. In fact, the great civil rights leader, Frederick Douglass, he opposed the raid, thinking the plan was doomed to failure. He was right. John Brown made a couple fatal mistakes. Number one is he had no plan of escape. There was no plan B. Once they got into the federal arsenal, they were stuck. Oh, and the second thing he did, he forgot to tell these slaves in Virginia that he was coming. So he's going to get guns for them and no one knows he's coming. And so, as a result, it is a failed raid. Very quickly, as he and his sons and his men get to the federal arsenal, they are surrounded by federal troops. And the raid is over in less than a day. 8 of his men die, including 2 of his own sons. John Brown is captured, he's tried, and he will eventually be hanged to prevent a lynch mob from doing it. Now, ultimately, he's convicted of treason, murder, and fomenting insurrection, one of the biggest crimes of the South. And ultimately, this ends a lifetime of failure, really, for John Brown, because he was not very successful. Again, yes, we laud him for the Pottawatomie Creek incident, and it's kind of almost comical. He used broadswords to kill people. At a time, people were using guns. We laud him for the Harper's Ferry raid, but it's a failure. So why do we care so much about John Brown? Because while he ends a lifetime of failures, on his deathbed, he begins to wax eloquent and makes a difference. Because John Brown, for all practical purposes, may have been insane, but he makes what we call a noble martyr. And prior to his death, he's able to give kind of his own last words. And he gives a very eloquent speech. I have it here for you. He says, "In the first place, I deny everything but what I have all along admitted of a design on my part to free slaves. That was all I intended. I never did intend murder or treason or destruction of property or to exercise or incite slaves to rebellion. I have another objection, and that is unjust that I should suffer such a penalty. Had I so interfered on behalf of the rich, the powerful, the intelligent, the so-called great, it would have been all right. Every man in this court would have deemed it an act worthy of reward rather than punishment. I believe that to have interfered as I have done, on behalf of God's despised poor, I did no wrong but right. Now, if it is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice, and mingle my blood with the blood of my children and the blood of millions in the slave country whose rights are disregarded by wicked, cruel, and unjust enactments, I say, let it be done." And yes, he was hanged on December 2nd, 1859. But this speech, this action of John Brown, stirs something in the North. Because here again, you have a white man willing to die for this cause. And what happens next is very interesting. This is the image that people remember of John Brown most. Now, this is obviously an artist's rendition. This obviously takes place many years later. Remember, he's hung in 1859. This picture obviously comes after the Civil War starts in 1861, because you see the Confederate and American flag that did not exist 2 years prior. But you see John Brown here looking again more and more Moses-like, with the Bible in one hand, the gun in the other. As a noble martyr, John Brown, his fame spreads through the land. To the North responds to his death with an outpouring of sympathy, with public rites of mourning not seen since George Washington's death and funeral. Henry David Thoreau compared John Brown to Christ. William Lloyd Garrison, you remember him? The liberator? He was a pacifist, even though he wanted the end of slavery. He actually wished that, quote, "success to every slave insurrection in the South." Ministers decried and glorified John Brown's treason as holy. It begins to galvanize the North. But to the South, it's their worst nightmare. This fills the South with dread and terror. There's this possibility now of a wave of slave revolts inspired by John Brown. There were hundreds of John Browns in Nat Turner's imaginary, hiding behind every bush. And they conclude that the North will stop at nothing to end their way of life by freeing the slaves. John Brown's raid signified to Southerners that there existed this black Republican plot in the North that was a raid against the slaveholders, who were now a permanent minority because of the greater population of the North, and there was no longer that slave-free balance in the Senate. So even though the Dred Scott decision validated, the South still had lots of power. And in fact, it was their will that was threatening democracy. John Brown, despite the abject failure of the raid at Harper's Ferry, it signified that people valued their democracy, that people would not sit idly by as their rights were trampled. Because this was 25% of the Southern white population inflicting their will on slavery across northern states, bypassing northern state constitutions and laws. And for this, John Brown became a symbol of galvanization to fight against that slave power. Now we come back, though, we'll talk about what happens next, which, of course, because 1857 was the Dred Scott decision, 1859 is John Brown, 1860 is a new election year and the beginning of the end. But until next time, take care and bye-bye.